C'est quoi c'est spécial? C'est quoi?
Traduction.
Ah ouais.
Et toi?
Enseignement. Ouais, enseignement. C'est dans le Facebook.
Quoi?
C'est ce que t'as compte sur Facebook, c'est?
Non. J'avoue que j'ai pas fini. C'est oui. Ah. Non, j'ai pas fini.
Moi, je l'ai commencé cette semaine.
J'ai pas eu le temps.
Studying these together, but if you have any questions, this is the time task. Anything in particular that you didn't understand or that you struggled with? No? Alright, so, make sure that everything's clear, that you feel comfortable analysing them, just in case they are at the exam as in other problems from right. Okay, so if there are no questions on this, we'll move on to David Malouf's Remembering Babylon. And what I want to do this week, just like we did for The Secret River, is to have a general introduction to the novel. Okay, so give you some background about the writer, explain to you some of the historical context for Remembering Babylon, then we'll have a look at the main characters, some of the main themes, etc. So it's a week of general introduction to Remembering Babylon. So this is what David Malouf looks like. Yes, he's not too young today. He was born in 1934. He's still alive. He's someone who, je me sens super concentrée là, this way. So, he's someone who's actually written lots of different types of writing. Malouf actually started out as a poet. I'm not sure if you noticed, but when you read Remembering Babylon, there's a very poetic or lyrical dimension to it that you don't have, for instance, in The Secret River. This very much comes from the fact that originally he really started out by writing poetry. Okay, so you really need, when you analyze Remembering Babylon, to take this lyrical, poetic dimension into account. He's also written short stories, he's written plays, he's also written, helped to write an opera and some of his works have been adapted as operas, and that's the case for Remembering Babylon. Okay, so he's someone that's been working on lots of different forms, and they all feed into each other, if you want. Okay, the poetry and the theatre and all of this feeds basically into his novels. He's of course most famous for his novels. He's written quite a lot. I didn't put a list up there. But he likes writing really short novels. As you can see, Remembering Babylon is very short, and most of what he wrote is actually quite short, quite dense, quite concise. Okay, again, I think we need to connect this to the fact that he also writes poetry. Malouf is what could be called a multicultural writer in Australia. He's got a Lebanese father and an English-born mother. So he is Australian, but as you can see, his family background, this is the case for like 90% of Australians today, okay? Most people do not have both grandparents that come from Australia. Sometimes they can have, well, both or grandparents. Sometimes they can have part of the family that dates back to colonization, but most people are recent-ish, over the last century, immigrants. So you can see that Malouf has got quite a varied family background. He's also someone who's travelled quite a lot. In particular, he lived in the UK for 10 years. So in the 50s and in the 60s, So he lived in the UK for 10 years. This is actually the case of a lot of Australian writers, in the sense that it's much easier for them to publicise their writing and to sell if they're outside of Australia. Okay, the reality is, in Australia, you've got 20 million people. So even if you're really, really famous in Australia, there are only so many books that you can sell. Most Australian writers need to reach a more international audience, and therefore a lot of them actually relocate, in particular in the US and the UK. The most famous example is someone called Peter Carey, that you might have heard of. He's an extremely well-known Australian writer, and he's been living in the US for like 20 or 30 years. To me, I don't see how he's Australian anymore. And frankly, if you like Australian, he's not the most interesting writer to come out of Australia. But he's mainstream, so he sells quite a lot. Yeah, so Malouf has lived in the UK for about 10 years. And at the moment he lives in Sydney, but he spends quite a bit of time in Tuscany, so he kind of makes the most of the seasons, by spending the nice seasons in Australia and then moving to Tuscany in Italy to spend the nice seasons there. Now, as I mentioned, in Australia, in Australia you can see, basically, if we think about literature, literature is often separated into three categories. That is, that you're going to have Aboriginal lit. That is going to be a separate category. As you can see, we're not reading Aboriginal lit at all, because we can't do everything. You also have, if you want, I guess, what would be mainstream Australian lit. If I simplify, most of the time this is going to be Anglo-Celtic literature. And then there's a final strand of literature that is often identified, not always, that is called multicultural literature. Now, if you remember, or not, in 1973, Australia officially defined its identity as a multicultural nation. If you remember, before that, Australia had actually defined itself as British under the White Australia policy. So you have this in your fascicule, just so you remember. Where are we? So if you remember at the beginning of the course, we spoke a little bit about Australian history. You can see that I divided roughly Australian history into 4 sections: Aboriginal presence before 1788, the colonial period until 1901, between 1901 and 1972, Australia under the White Australia policy, when there were immigration restrictions that restricted the entry in Australia to people that were white. At the time, this included mostly Germanic British and Scandinavian people. That is, under the White Australia policy, Spanish people would not have been considered white. And Greek people would not have been considered white either. And you can see that there was a very, in a way, abrupt shift in 1973 where Australia completely redefined its identity as no longer being homogeneous and British to being an identity characterized by heterogeneity, by variety. Okay, so the Australian identity since 1973 has been understood, has been thought of as being diverse. This was a way to open immigration to lots of people, to also accept, which is not the case in France, the fact that minorities can have their own culture in the public space. Okay? In France, you can have your own culture, but it's supposed to be in your private space. Okay? Publicly, France is very, I won't say the rest. Okay, so this is the specificity of Australia, and a lot of writers coming from recent-ish immigration, from non-Anglo-Celtic immigration, have been labelled multicultural writers. So these include lots of different writers. In particular, there are a lot of authors that are Asian Australian. So lots of interesting Asian Australian writers writing to people of Chinese, sometimes of Japanese, Vietnamese, Filipino, Malaysian, Singaporean, Hong Kong, whatever you want, Indonesian background. So basically you've got a whole strand of writing that is identified as being slightly different. Now, whether or not this is a good idea to separate the two is a whole other debate. Okay? The fact of separating categorically in terms of categories between basically white and non-Anglo-Celtic writing is a little bit problematic, but it is true that most of the time multicultural writers are going to take a slightly different view on Australian themes. Most of the time, Grenville in The Secret River writes about really classical Australian themes, like really, really classical, as opposed to multicultural writers that often try to reinvent Australian identities in different terms. Okay, so this is why they've been separated. Honestly, I think there are some positive aspects of separating them and some really negative ones. Now, because multicultural writers really started writing in the 80s and 90s, it's become more and more common, and they're less and less separated from the rest. Okay, but it really depends basically on the library or the bookshop where you go, how they separate Australian lit. One thing that's clear is that most of the time they will never mix Aboriginal lit with the rest. Okay, it's a question of sensitivity. All right. Multicultural writer. Yes. The issue, of course, over separating multicultural writers is the idea that these people necessarily are taken to represent multicultural Australia. Okay, so this is one of the issues with that label, and this is the case for any minority writing. If you label someone as an Aboriginal writer, you're going to take it for granted that they represent Aboriginal Australians. Okay, so it's a little bit the same with multicultural writers. Asian Australian writers, for example, their writing is often taken to represent that community in Australia. So this is something that has been associated with that form of writing, and Malouf has been particularly vocal, particularly public about rejecting this, saying that he doesn't represent the Lebanese or the multicultural community in Australia. To him, he just represents himself. It's just his own fiction. But as you can see, there are always a lot of tensions as to how a work is going to be recuperated by a minority or interpreted by the mainstream. Now, if we speak more generally about his style and his writing, Malouf has, this is not the case in Remembering Babylon, but Malouf is obsessed with the world wars. Okay, he's written tons tons of novels about the World Wars. So this is something that he's really interested in. And you might have noticed in Remembering Babylon that there isn't that much of a plot. Okay? There's not much happening truly in Remembering Babylon. If you take The Secret River, you've got lots of events that you can actually list. In Remembering Babylon, of course it's shorter, but you can see that there isn't that much happening. What Maloof is doing is actually exploring the psychology around certain events. Okay, so if you want, his style is very much one of, his plots are not necessarily about action, they're more about psychological exploration of characters' reactions to a certain event. So of course in Remembering Babylon you've got basically the presence of Jemmy in the settlement, and the whole novel is the psychological exploration of what this does in the village and on the children. Okay, so you can see that this is where his interest lies. He's basically writing about psychology, about lives, rather than about action. Okay, if you transform this into a movie, it wouldn't take too long. In particular, Maloof is interesting in voicing, in a lot of his novels, giving a voice to people that don't have a voice. So this is pretty obvious in Remembering Babylon. You can apply it straight away to the character of Jemmy, okay, who has trouble communicating, and Remembering Babylon is trying to reconstitute, in a way, the story of his life, the story of his psychology. As part of this interest for psychology, you might have noticed as well that often Maloof is going to represent one event from several perspectives. Okay, this is also the case in Remembering Babylon, where sometimes you're going to have one event and then it's going to be described by several characters. Again, the idea is to explore the psychological complexity at work, in life. Okay, so really take into account for Maloof, you'll see that narration changes a lot more than in The Secret River. In The Secret River, you've got one mode of narration from beginning to end. I'm not saying The Secret River is not good, okay, that's not the question. The question is we've got a very different type of writing. Similar narration from beginning to end, same focus on the same characters. If you look at Remembering Babylon, basically every single chapter changes focalization and narration, okay, and changes perspective on the event. In particular, when Jemmy is visited by the Aborigines, you see this from several perspectives. Okay? This is a very important aspect, and you'll see that a lot of our discussions will focus on this psychological aspect rather than on the significance of actions as we did for The Secret River. Alright, so if we speak about the historical background for Remembering Babylon, this is the date of publication of The Secret River. Remembering Babylon was published 12 years earlier, in 1983. So you can imagine that, unlike Judith Wright, where we had poems that dated to the 1940s, we've got pretty much the same context for the two novels, except that Remembering Babylon comes basically 10 years earlier. So some of the things that we've already discussed for The Secret River, but that apply very specifically to Remembering Babylon, are the 1988 bicentenary. You remember in 1988 being the 200-year anniversary of the landing of the First Fleet in Australia, that the government decided to celebrate with great pomp. Okay, so you remember that there were a whole series of debates about whether this should be celebrated, if it should be celebrated, how it should be celebrated, who should be included, and how. Il me semble que je vous avais montré ces images-là of the big, they invited basically ships to reproduce the arrival of the First Fleet in the Sydney Harbour, and then I showed you, I think, those posters, 88, there's a lot to celebrate, and some of the opponents to this, Rock Against Racism. Okay, so pretty much keep this in mind, that you have, when Maloof was probably writing this whole debate around the bicentenary, around what Australian identity was. Okay, so keep this very strongly in mind. The other thing that's very important for remembering Babylon that was slightly less important for the Secret River. The Secret River was very much informed by the history wars. Je le mets ici, up, 1990s, 2000s, the history wars. This is what the Secret River really fits into. Remembering Babylon really fits into the policy of reconciliation. I'm not sure if you noticed this, but you do have a lot of reflection in the novel about reconciliation, about bringing people together, about communication, etc. This very much fits in the context of the time, where after the bicentenary, the Prime Minister of the time declared that the official policy towards Aboriginal people would be one of reconciliation. Comme je vous le disais, c'est encore techniquement la politique officielle du gouvernement, sauf que depuis, il y a pas mal d'eau qui ont coulé sous les ponts, et bon, la réconciliation, ça se passe assez moyennement, notamment vu les dernières choses qui sont passées sur la reconnaissance constitutionnelle. But basically, at the time, there was actually quite a lot of hope. You also have to see that Sydney was going towards the Olympics in 2000, and that because of the Olympics, they were trying to create this harmonious image of Australia. I'm not sure what age you were when the Sydney Olympics were going on, but Cathy Freeman, an Indigenous runner, won a gold medal, so she stood as a symbol for, you know, this harmony, etc. So you have to think that the 1990s were pretty much optimistic times, and then the late 1990s were very pessimistic in Australia. The other thing to take into account is, as I mentioned, the general policy of multiculturalism. In the sense that in Australia there was a shift to multiculturalism, as I said, in 1973. What's multiculturalism? As a policy.
To accept different cultures.
Okay. It's more than that, because any country does that. Even France does it. Multiculturalism can refer to lots of things. Well, not can refer, but cultural. The adjective can be ambiguous. Any state can be described as being multicultural. Okay? That in any state of the world, I challenge you, there's not one state in the world that is not multicultural. There are always a variety of cultures in a state, whether that's in migrants or people that originally lived there. So we can give this adjective to pretty much any country. If you take this in the strict sense, that is a country that has a multicultural policy or that exercises a policy of multiculturalism, this actually refers to countries that have a specific type of policy. They're countries that are going to, how can I say this, acknowledge the role of minority and give them a public space to express their differences. C'est ici que la France n'est pas multiculturelle. Comptez le nombre de personnes à la télé qui ne sont pas blanches. Vous avez besoin que d'une main. So it's basically about acknowledging the role of minorities, acknowledging their presence, in particular giving them a space in the public space to basically exist. Okay, so you can you can think in particular about the existence of quotas, okay, in particular on the radio, on TV, to have people from minorities, to represent people from minorities. In Australia, this has also taken the shape of a TV channel, which is the multicultural TV channel, SBS. Okay, you've got different TV channels. SBS is the multicultural one, so usually on SBS you're going to have movies that are going to be subtitled in original languages, and in particular in the languages where there's a lot of migration in Australia. Okay, so Italian, Greek, Turkish. You're going to have Chinese, you're going to have quite a lot of Japanese. Okay, so movies, multicultural movies on SBS. What is also on SBS is that every day you have the news in the local language of different countries. Okay, so I can't remember the times, but say every day at 9:30 you're going to get French news. Then at 10 you're going to get German news, then you're going to get Chinese news, then you're going to get Taiwanese news, then Japanese, then Filipino, then Malaysian, etc. Okay, so there's a real effort, as you can see. These are subtitled to help people, but they're given in French. Pour la France, par exemple, c'est les news de France 2, qui sont diffusées sur SBS. D'accord, avec un décalage d'un jour, mais vous avez quand même ça. Réfléchissez en France, des choses similaires qui existent, ça n'existe pas du tout, d'accord, dans l'espace public. À la France, c'est très uniforme culturellement, d'accord, dans l'espace public, en tout cas à la télévision, la radio, c'est extrêmement homogène. So this is what you have. As part of this, you also had, we're getting to literature, there were also a number of prizes and some funding that was available for multicultural writers. Okay? In particular, in the 1980s, there was quite a lot of money that was given to writers to help them write, to help them generate plays, to help them generate poems, novels, etc. So you can see that in the 1990s, basically, we're at a moment when multiculturalism was still being very actively funded. Je vous avais jamais montré les langues qui sont parlées à la Sécu. Je vous ai jamais montré. Let me find it. Ça vaut le coup du détour. Alors, laissez-moi voir. Where's that? Bless you. That's not it. 3. Je vais y arriver. Bah alors mes petits... Ah. Donc en France, vous allez à la Sécu, vous ne parlez pas français, bah vous allez chercher quelqu'un qui parle français. Parce que c'est votre problème. En Australie, vous allez à Centrelink. If you go to Centrelink in Australia and you have issue with English, you can actually order a translator and an interpreter to help you with this. These are the languages that they can translate in. That's the first page of languages. And I challenge you to know all of these languages. Most of these languages I have no idea where they're from. But that's the first page, and that's the second page. These are all of the languages where you can request translation. So of course you need to make an appointment, but you can see, even in migration, most of the documents are going to be published in lots of different languages. Now the people that migrate to Australia have to learn English. Of course, that's not the question, but you can see that there's clear investment in a truly multicultural policy that is allowing migrants to maintain their own culture, notably by watching the news in their own language, being funded to create literature, etc. C'est pas mal, hein? Ça change. Mais ça coûte cher. All right. Now, today the situation is a bit different. There's someone not very nice who accessed the prime ministerial position in 1997, John Howard, who basically cut all funding to multicultural actions. Okay, so today there's no particular funding that goes into multicultural things. SBS still exists, but the policy of multiculturalism has been pretty much sapped completely by Howard. But at the time of Remembering Babylon, you can see all of this energy that was going into reconciliation, thinking about Australian history, multicultural writers really embracing basically this diverse identity of Australia. And then you can also connect to Remembering Babylon the Mabo versus Queensland trial, which led to a law called the Native Title Act. If you remember, that's the end of Terra Nullius. That is the end of considering Australia as being legally empty of people, and the recognition of a specific form of property, a specific title of property for Aboriginal people. So we're right next to the moment of the publication of Remembering Babylon. As you can see, there aren't that many Aboriginal figures in Remembering Babylon, but obviously you can see that all of these changes were part of the context in which David Malouf wrote. Alright, so try to keep all of these in mind. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait maintenant? Oh yes. So let's speak in a bit more detail about Remembering Babylon. C'est quoi ça? Pardon. Alors, chouchou. Excusez-moi, c'est mon ordinateur qui se sent pas bien, il fait des crises cardiaques en ce moment. Voilà, gentil. Okay, so let's have a look at the list of main characters that you have from Remembering Babylon. This way we can pretty much at least have an idea of who's in it. This will allow us to clarify a couple of things about the plot, and then maybe we can talk about its main themes. So tell me, what are some of the main characters we have in Remembering Babylon? Yeah? Yeah. Okay, so we've got Jamie. Alors, il y a deux orthographes pour son nom, Fairly. Yeah, so main character, obviously, this you need to analyze. Okay, this is not an innocent name, Fairly. Okay. What else? Who else? Yep, so Lachlan. Lachlan Beatty, the small boy, who's well. Who else do we have?
Janet McFlow.
Janet, yeah, the name's
The daughter of. Yeah.
Yep, Janet McIver. Who else?
Jock and Ellen McIver.
Yeah, so we've got the parents, Jock and Ellen. McIver. As we find, yeah.
Reverend Fraser.
Sorry?
Reverend Fraser.
Yep, so we've got Fraser, let me see. Are we going to give him all about Mr. Fraser? Because he's not technically he's technically a minister. Mm.
Can we call him Reverend?
No, that's a religious title.
Okay.
So he's the minister. What do you? Yeah, so we've got the second child. So you've got the parents, the two daughters. What is the relationship of Lachlan to the?
Nephew. What's his name?
Yeah, he's the nephew or cousin. Obviously depends who you look at. So the nephew or cousin. What's the difference between them in terms of where they come from? Yeah. So you've got Lachlan, who represents the newest sort of arrival from Scotland. The girls are obviously also originally from Scotland, but have never seen Scotland. Okay, so when they play together, you'll see this when we work on the very first pages of the novel. You've got Lachlan, for instance, who's seen snow before, and the girls who haven't. Okay, so there in the novel, they symbolize the Australian-born people, and Lachlan symbolizes the foreign-born, overseas-born people. All right. Who else?
George Abbott, the
Yeah.
schoolmaster.
Yeah, so we've got the schoolmaster, George Abbott. George Abbott, the schoolmaster, who's quite young, you remember, 19 years old, but he's trying to look much older. And he's hoping to achieve a lot. Who doesn't in the novel?
Barney Mason is the employer of Jamie. Well,
Yeah.
he's employing him.
Okay, alright, so we've got Barney Mason. He employs someone who's important in the novel.
Andy.
Yeah, Andy McKillop. Juste que j'écris ça correctement, c'est ça. He's the one who invents that the Aborigines gave Jemmy a stone. Do you remember that important scene? This is a very important scene, notably in the psychological exploration of him creating something basically that he fears or trying to become interesting for the community, trying to find some legitimacy, some authority from this story where he becomes the center of attention. And then you know that we see the same scene later on from the eyes of Jemmy, well, not from his eyes, but basically being narrated and explaining to us what the Aborigines actually brought to him. L'histoire avec la pierre. The story with the stone. Because he sees Jemmy with the Aborigines and then he imagines that he saw them exchanging a stone. So you've got the whole fantasy over danger and anxiety in there. Alright, who else do we have? Yeah. So we've got Hector Gosper, justement appelé Heck, who's not particularly developed in the novel as a character, unlike some others, but he, I think he reacts to when Jemmy takes the hammer in the village. He's hair-lipped as well, and he's younger, even younger than George Abbott, so he plays a minor role in the novel. Who else do we have? What, please? Yeah, so we've got Jean Sweetman still in the village. This is not an innocent name either, okay, so you need to take it into account. He serves in the novel, I'm not sure if you remember, but he serves in the novel as a compass for judgment on Jemmy's arrival, because he's trusted, he's appreciated, he's a reliable character, but he basically takes his distance from Jock when they start housing Jemmy. Okay, so you can see that he serves as this, yes, I guess morally upright character, respected character, and obviously his reaction to Jemmy are all the more important in the novel, when he reacts in particular when Jemmy's naked in the village. Alright, who else do we have?
Ned Corcoran.
Yeah, so he's on the other side of the compass. This is an angry, violent person. Distrusted, not respected. Who else? Let me see. That's everyone from the village. Queen? Yeah, so we've got two characters that are located geographically outside the settlement. You've got Mrs. Hutchins and sa copine, Vincent. Yeah, so yeah, Leona, il l'appelle aussi Miss Gonzalez. What do we know about these two? They're pretty shady characters in the novel. They're very, there's not that much detail about them. What's the connection between them? Where are they from? What do we know about them? Je passe en attendant ça. Ready? Yeah, okay, so they live together. It's not actually clear whether they're related or not. because Leonard calls Mrs. Hutchins Ma at times, but there's no indication that they're mother and daughter. There's no indication whether they're goddaughter and godmother or niece or anything, whether she's a companion or not. So there's a very unclear relationship. This is never specified in the novel. And in fact, most of their attitudes, behaviors, and histories are apart from the rest of the other characters in the novel. Where is Mrs. Hutchins from? You remember when they go to her place, there's always really exciting furniture. Like the furniture's different, everything looks a bit refined from other areas. The places that are mentioned in connection to her are Macau and Malacca. Okay, Macau, which used to be a Portuguese enclave in not very far from Hong Kong. Okay, so in what is today sort of southern China. Okay, so Macau and Malacca is a strait. Okay, the Strait of Malacca, that is basically in the southern tip of Malaysia. Okay, where Singapore is, etc. Okay, so it's not quite clear where they're from. It looks like they could have some Portuguese heritage. In particular, we're being told that Leona has a darker complexion. She could potentially be Spanish or something like this. Okay, so this is never clarified. What is clear is that they have a different culture, different knowledge. They've traveled much more widely than any of the other characters. So they represent, in a way, cosmopolitanism. And they represent this connection to the outside world, outside of Scotland and Australia, that most of the characters have. They're also important in the sense that they're outside the settlement. Okay, so this symbolizes this marginality. You know that Mrs. Hutchins will have a whole session on the bees in Remembering Babylon, but Mrs. Hutchins is the one who introduces Janet to the bees. Okay, so she's very important in connection to that. And obviously this is where they put Jemmy after he's attacked. He lives with them. Okay, so you've got as well this. They symbolize this area of exclusion, but also protection outside of the settlement. All right, we have not mentioned the people from Jemmy's past. These are the characters that we're missing.
We have Aborigines.
Yeah, Aborigines, Aboriginals, l'équivalent de nigger.
Aboriginal people.
Yes, that's better. Okay, so we've got unidentified Aboriginal people. We have no names for them. This is something to take into account as well, and to consider why Maloof made that choice. There are no names whatsoever for Aboriginal people. So that's part of his past. What about his London past and on the ship? Do you guys remember any names? Yeah, we've got Willet. Dirty. So that's from his past in London. That's his employer. That he kind of killed. And who do we have on the boat? There are lots of memories from the boat. We've got Mosey and the Irish that are basically bullying him. And then some really minor characters. We've got Crouch and his daughter, Crouch. But that's on the boat and that's much more minor. But Mosey and the Irish are the figures of oppression, basically of him being oppressed on the boat before he's pretty much deposed. And left then to be, and then that he lives with Aborigines for 16 years. Again, we do have the presence of Aborigines, and we'll speak quite a lot about this, how Aborigines are present, how they're represented, why is their representation limited in the novel. Alright, I guess that's it for the main characters that we have in Remembering Babylon. Let me look at the time, we're good. So, what would you say are the themes in the novel? Some of the major themes that we can identify. Okay, je vais noter in-betweenness. In-betweenness, okay, yes. This is a very important point in the novel, the fact that Jemmy never truly fits with Aborigines and he never truly fits in the settlement and he never truly fits anyway. What else?
There's a reaction. Well, there's reactions to the unknown.
Yep.
Because, for example, they don't know how to deal with him. As you say, he had different points of view, so people don't really know who he is, what he's doing here.
Yep.
It doesn't really talk.
Definitely, yeah, reactions to the unknown, the unfamiliar, what as well cannot be categorized. I guess this is connected to the fact that Jimmy is he's not truly European like the settlers, he's not truly Aboriginal, he's neither one nor the other, okay, he's very much in between. And as you said, this is what destabilizes the settlement, they don't really know what to make of him.
And there is the unknown land as well, because at the beginning they talk about when they settled, when Jock, or the MacIver family settled. So you have a whole part on the unknown land.
Yep. Definitely, you've got the, in particular, the fact that they identify a clear separation between the settlement, the area that's known and that's civilized or controlled, and what stands outside. And outside of that, you've got all of the threats, Aborigine, imagined threats, Aborigines, animals, whatever, all sorts of things that lie out there. So it's true that you do have a lot of the psychological exploration is around this, around anxieties, around what is not known, what is not familiar, and how to appropriate it, how to control it, how to categorize it in the novel. And what? Okay. What would you connect it to?
Jimmy's connection to the land.
Yep.
And also the minister and his land.
Okay. Okay, alright. So a spiritual dimension, a dimension of the sacred. I'm not sure if I'd see the phrase's connection to his land as being spiritual, but
When he works the land, Jimmy believes he has a kind of spiritual connection with the land.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. I guess we can mention as well the connection with the land, which is a major preoccupation in this. And Jamie stands as a figure of knowledge who has specific knowledge of the land. You know, when he's I think when he's showing around plants to Fraser, and he knows that they're Aborigines, but he doesn't say anything, and he knows this or that plant, and he just lets him plot along, kind of not telling him everything that he knows. You can see that he's a key away into Aboriginal knowledge, into specialized knowledge about the landscape. What else? Yeah.
Another thing could be identity.
Yeah.
Because in the novel, people in the settlements always wonder if Jenny is really or not British.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
they call him white black.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I guess we can connect this to the in-betweenness. But I'll write it there because it also works for quite a lot of other characters. There are a lot of characters that try to figure out who they are, and a lot of them reveal who they are through their interactions with Jemmy. One thing we didn't mention about the character names is the fact that Janet has a different name at the end of the novel. What's that? Yeah, Sister Monica, so she's become a nun. And she's changed her name. Okay, so this is an important bit as well, of course. What are some of the would include? What are some of the, we've talked a lot about the fact that Jemi is in between whites and Aborigines. There are also other ways in which Jemi is destabilizing. What are some of the problems with his identity?
Language?
Yep. FM communication. So language and communication, definitely. The bees have to be put into that. I'm not sure if you were happy with the episodes with the bees. Usually it puzzles students quite a bit. But you have to think about the role of language. How Jemi communicates with Aborigines, how he communicates with other people, the fact that he's lost pretty much the English language and never fully manages to reconstitute it. Failures of communication across between characters as well. This is quite important. There's another aspect of him. So he fails to communicate. He's neither white nor black. There's a final aspect in his behavior that's very typical. The fact that he's not fully an adult. That is that Jemi, in a way, in many ways acts like a child. So he's like a child in an adult's body. And I'm not sure if you saw, but there's a whole reflection, especially at the end of the novel, on the role of childhood, the idealization of childhood. When Janet, or Sister Monica, and Lachlan talk about their connection to Jemi right at the end of the novel, you've got a lot on childhood and the importance of that moment. Okay, so Jemi as a child, not quite an adult. And in particular, in the story of Jemi, everything you get is stories from when he was a child. In London, on the boat, a little bit with Aborigines, not much, but you do have this idea that childhood is this central turning point in your life, that it's a determining, basically, period in your life. Any other thoughts?
I would add in communication the loneliness of certain characters, like the couple, the MacIver couple. They're very lonely, like outside of the world, their settlement. They talk about the importance of neighbors and stuff. So yeah, but that goes with communication or lack of communication.
Yeah, I guess we can list it. Isolate. I guess we can also add marginality and the connection to the community, whether you're isolated or included in the community. Pretty much the whole novel centers on that, inclusion in a community or exclusion from that community. Any other thoughts? I guess we'll speak about themes as we go. Obviously the idea is to kind of think about the novel in very general terms. Of course, you've got colonization that's very much central. You've got the novel taking place, what is it, in the 1850s? Yeah, around the middle of the 19th century. So obviously, the whole novel is basically centered on that. We talked about the land, but we can speak more generally about the connection to nature. That works quite well. And also about reconciliation between the communities. I guess we can connect all of this to in-betweeners, isolation, etc. Si on connecte ça, ça marche bien. Otherness connected with the unknown. in the sense that you have a whole recording of Jemmy's arrival. They're trying to make a recording of this. You've got memories of childhood, the fact that Lachlan and Janet really try to remember their childhood. And you also have, there's a very crucial moment in the novel, I'm not sure if you got that, when Jemmy tries to get back his writing, his own writing, thinking that this has this almost supernatural dimension, and it just takes, unfortunately, copies from the students. That's too bad, he's a bit stupid, isn't he? Basically you do have this whole idea of recording history and memory in the novel. And may I remind you that this is in the title, Remembering Babylon. So this is an important theme that we'll talk about. Alright, so I propose a 5-minute break.
Mais je connais pas les gens. Oh, maman.
Alors, toi tu es où?
Moi je suis
Tu es là? Tu passes avec Anaïs, Paul et Héloïse.
Qui? Je sais pas c'est qui.
Attends, on va.
Lisa.
Anaïs.
Lisa.
Non, Lisa,
aussi.
pas avec toi.
Oui. Non,
Non, Lisa, non, 15
non,
heures.
c'est 15.
Donc, Anaïs, Paul et Héloïse.
Ce sont qui? Moi je... Et toi? T'es où?
Moi je passe avec... Moi je suis là, je passe avec Maxime, Payam et Claire.
Si par exemple les étudiants changent leur...
Ah oui, c'est possible.
Oui.
C'est possible.
Les amacons arrivent.
Bah, apparemment, il y a beaucoup d'examens avant les vacances.
Les sarrajos.
Oui. Mais c'est
Ça,
écrit
c'est
comment
très
on le sait. Et j'ai commencé par hier, tu sais, je lisais pour le oui, non. Oui, il faut faire la demande. Moi, je vais le faire. Parce qu'il y a aucune pratique.
Oui, oui. Ouais, c'est pour ça elle a donné. Non, mais c'est pas sûr.
Je vais le faire parce que on n'a pas de pratique. Et du coup, on va arriver aux examens. Donc c'est important de le faire.
Parce que il faut qu'on apprenne par cœur, tu vois, la théorie, quelque chose comme ça pour appliquer. Mais comme ça, parce qu'on a beaucoup de dimensions dans les. Vraiment.
Tu as fait le devoir d'entraînement de traduction.
Moi, pas encore. Traduction, non.
Et grammaire.
Non, parce que moi, je veux concentrer grammaire, traduction, phonétique après l'examen.
Ah oui, d'accord.
T'as vu quelque chose que t'as envoyé? Je t'ai envoyé?
Oui, j'ai vu. C'est quoi cette histoire? Payam m'a parlé ce matin. Ils veulent augmenter les frais d'inscription juste pour les étrangers.
Félicitations.
Mais ils veulent que la France attire des gens. Et puis
Oui, j'ai entendu tout, mais c'est pas logique. Oui, c'est pas logique.
Et pourquoi pas pour les étudiants français? Parce que s'ils veulent arriver à un système comme aux États-Unis ou en Angleterre, alors pourquoi pas tout le monde?
Oui, je constate que les Américains ne viennent pas ici pour étudier, parce qu'ils n'ont pas besoin de commencer à étudier ici. Et les Européens, ils n'ont pas de problème dans cette histoire-là. Et il reste les pays comme nous.
Mais les Européens, par exemple, si tu es espagnol, tu veux venir étudier en France, tu payes aussi.
Non.
Comment ça, non?
Autour de l'Europe.
Outside.
Ouais, outside Europe. Mais comment ils veulent attirer les gens, les étudiants? Parce qu'ils ont dit qu'on veut attirer les étudiants en France, mais après, ils ont annoncé sur le site de l'ambassade allemande. Ils ont annoncé, ils ont publié.
On va voir ça.
Je sais pas.
For the rest of today's class, what I want to do is to analyze the beginning of the novel, so to do some pretty detailed work about it. So what I'm going to ask you to take the beginning of the novel on the very first page, it starts with one day in the middle of the 19th century. If you turn the page, I'm not sure what edition you have, all the way to the first line break, which we've got a sentence that ends British object. Vous l'avez tous on page 3? So what I'd like you guys to do is to analyze this. You know that the beginning of the novel is always going to be crucial. It's the moment when you've got the writer introducing the main themes, introducing the characters, setting a tone for the novel, getting you into their fictional worlds. Okay, so it's immensely important. You'll see in whatever you study that studying in the beginning is often a clue to understanding most of the novel. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to work on these 2 points. First, consider what main themes are established in the passage. Secondly, how is Jamie introduced and characterized? Et vous êtes en L3, donc je veux pas que vous disiez « Ah, c'est comme un animal ». Non. Quel animal? Dans quel ordre? Quelle narration? Quelle focalisation? Quelle utilisation des adjectifs? Quelle est l'utilisation de la syntaxe qui correspond à ça? D'accord? Donc pas juste une petite description, une vraie analyse comme si vous aviez ça à commenter au partiel. D'accord? Donc essayez de travailler là-dessus. Je vous laisse, je sais pas, 25 minutes, d'accord, pour vraiment travailler en détail, essayez de bien voir quelles sont la variété des thèmes qui sont établis. De nouveau, le début d'un roman, c'est vraiment crucial. C'est le moment où l'auteur vous emmène pour vous amener dans son monde fictionnel, pour vous donner le ton de ce qui va se passer. Donc posez-vous bien cette question-là, et bien sûr, si vous voulez, vous pouvez travailler à plusieurs là-dessus. Alright? See you at 35.
plus dedans. Je pense qu'ils ont dit que the first view was in at the first. Je pense que oui, parce que j'ai déjà fait ça à propos de master, mais je pense que peut-être en master on doit payer, mais c'est pas sûr. Ouais, je crois que les 4. Il a marqué ses jours, mais c'est étudiant, il n'a pas marqué le nom.
Encore 3 minutes. Okay, I guess we'll start with the second question. It'll probably be easier to talk about this and then to look at the first one. So what are some of the things that you noticed in this? What are some of the things that need to be analysed, that need to be mentioned in connection to Jeremy's introduction and characterization?
children are playing hunters. They are hunting trucking wolves. So it's introduced as the outcome of the hunt. So the first thing,
Ants?
the hunt.
The
outcome
hunt.
of the hunt.
Okay, sorry.
So I think that at first is already depicted as an animal or an animal-like, and then is more like a mirage, a watery, heat struck, elongated, and airily indistinct. So something like mirage and something not clear, and then there's a bit of the action, like bowling, leaping, flying toward the children. So we've got earth for the animal like the wolf. Then we've got the water with watery and also wounded waterbird also. So once again water, and then waterbird, so it's also air. So we've got three of the four main elements, which is quite interesting because after that we've got the last one, fire, with the sun bleached air. So we can also say that sun bleach can also relate to fire. So we've got the four elements in there. So therefore it also means that it's morphing into not something not animal-like, but more mythical, beast-like. And my point is that after that we also have a reference to the mythical thing because of the way that Lahan, he confronts the beast, even if he's scared, even if he's afraid, even if he's conscious that his weapon is not useful. It's in a way, but maybe think about the antique tales, the antiquity, facing beasts and stuff like that. So that's what I thought.
Okay, all right. You mentioned a lot of things, so I'm not sure if you could be heard all the way to the back. But I agree with you. There is the context of the children hunting, so they're playing, and there's a tenuous line between what they're imagining and then they're brought back to reality, but at first they're struggling to see if this is real or not real. So you do have this idea in the introduction of Jemmy that he's evoked as part of a game. This game is a game of hunting, so straight away you've got that sort of tension that is set up. And then you've got, yes, that early moment when they're not sure if it's a mirage, if it's actually something, and then they're trying to figure out what it is. I guess you can work with your point that there are the four elements, that we're starting with something from the earth. I guess he is described as a bit of the land, emerging as the bit of the swamp. And then you've got water, and then the bird, and the fire. I guess the important point to make, as you said, is the fact that the children have trouble identifying what this is. So referring whether you'd like to describe this as being a reference to the four elements or in another way. Clearly they're struggling to understand what this is, and this is the main point. This is how Maloof is trying to convey this. There is also, I agree with you that there's a mythic dimension, and I guess there are lots of clues where we can find this. Jemmy as a beast, sort of something. I guess you can connect it to the whole fact that they're playing, and that they're in that world, and therefore they start by interpreting Jemmy through words taken from the game, pretty much. So you've got that idea. All right, thank you. Remember? Shay.
Where we work together. So we noticed that Jemmy is introduced through the kids' eyes, and especially Lachlan's eyes, and there is a graduation as you come closer. So first, as you said, is a thing, is something, a thing of substance, bowling, leaping, something. At the beginning, then it becomes an animal, a water bird, a very skinny sort of feverish animal, and then it becomes more human-like, being a scarecrow, so it gets a sort of human shape. And, well, in the passage we had to read, is not an actual human. It becomes a human when he starts speaking. So it's when he said, "Do not shoot," then in the next paragraph it will be, "It was a white man." So, yeah, there is that graduation we noticed. And something else we wanted to say is that at the beginning we are in an imaginary world, innocence world. And then when you arrive, when Lachlan said a black, they just drop into the real world. You know, they're sort of scared of black Aboriginal people. They're probably their education that told them that be careful, they're coming. Because they say we're being raided by blacks. After so many false alarms, it had come. So yeah, they're scared of it.
For me, it was like the encounter of two worlds. We have the world of settlement, we have the world of the Aboriginal people. The writers, for me, I think he just really showed the nature of settlers, because the kids, when they are playing, they're hunters. They try to say the real nature of settlers are, you know, like dominant. They are like hunters. They try to get this land. But the way that the Jimmies was shown in this passage was the real Aboriginal person, the thing that is coming from the world. So it's kind of like the, you know, comparison between two worlds, the world of the natures and the world of the settlers. But for the introduction for the Jimmies, it's just like, as my friend said, is a gradual evolution of the brain. At first he's a thing, and then the more this word, two words, we have the word of Aboriginal people and the word of settler. The more these people that are coming closer to the world of the settler or English people or white people, they become more civilized. When they are far away, they consider as like an object or something. And then the way it's coming closer to this world, it gets the shapes. Like the Jimmy's, when he was far away outside of the fence, was considered as a thing, and the more he was getting closer to the world, he'd get the shapes, and then until he just jumped over the fence, and then he thought, no, he's a human being.
Okay.
And then it also shows the nature of the settlers, like the violence they have. For instance, the kids, when he saw the monster-like things, they got the stick like a, you know, shooting gun. The way they reacted to this kid was violence. Also, it tries to show the nature of the settlers for me.
Okay, alright, together that's quite a lot that is mentioned. I agree with you. You do need to analyze the graduation. Jamie is described through a number of steps. I guess you all identified this. You can see he's a bit of the swamp, well, he's something unreal. He's a part of the land, a part of the swamp. Then he's described more in terms of a bird. Then he's described more as a thing. You do need, I guess, that you probably noticed at the bottom of the second page that he's referred to with a neutral pronoun. You're being told a bit of blue rag what was at its middle from blah blah blah. Okay, so this is what indicates as well the fact that he's not actually being given human shape. As you said, we move closer to this human shape with the scarecrow, but there's an idea still of something unreal, something completely unnatural as well. They're imagining pretty much a scarecrow that would have been gifted life or something that starts moving. So you can connect it, of course, with the children's imaginary world and imagination, but you also need to consider the unnaturalness of what is being described. They're basically describing an unfamiliar scene. And then at the end, as you said, I think this is a very important point for the rest of the novel. It's the language that defines him as a human being. It's that moment when Jemmy actually shifts and is recognized as being a human being when he actually speaks. And the fact that in the rest of the novel, Jemmy's language never really evolves. is a problem in itself as well, and that communication, that lack of communication, is a theme that runs throughout the novel. You might have noticed it already. So do think about this. I agree with the other point that was made. I think, I guess we can connect it to the first question, but one thing that is established is a clear dichotomy, settlement outside the settlement. I'm sure you guys saw this. There's a very binary differentiation between the forest beyond, or the swamp beyond, and the settlement. What is known and safe, what is unknown, what is unsafe, where danger can come from. And you can see, as you said, that some of the education, some of the prejudices of the settlers in children, c'est pas innocent que ce soit des personnages d'enfants qui voient Jamie en premier, d'accord? Parce que les gamins, ils disent toujours ce qu'ils pensent. Vous n'avez pas on va dire, de blocage, de filtre. Parce que disent les gamins. So you can see when they say black, it's a black. This is about what they've been told. Have they been told to interpret those areas outside, beyond the settlement? Okay, so you can see, as you said, some of the prejudices of the settlers and their representation of the world, which is one of a binary, outside, inside, savage, civilized, known, unknown. Okay, you've got this really binary moment. Why do you have this binary? To establish Jamie as an in-between figure, you need to have clear categories. D'accord? Vous ne pouvez pas avoir tout un roman basé sur une figure dans l'entre-deux si vous n'avez pas un monde dichotomique. D'accord? Donc cette partie-là, on passe sur le premier thème, on s'en fout, sur la première question, mais peu importe. Cette partie, elle établit deux mondes entièrement séparés, bien sûr dans l'image des settlers, dans l'image des enfants, et c'est parce que vous avez cette conception du monde en termes binaires que Jamie, il n'arrive pas à rentrer, et que Jamie, il est problématique, parce qu'il empêche de garder cette vision binaire du monde. D'accord? Donc il y a besoin, en fait, pour Remembering Babylon, pour toute cette exploration psychologique, d'avoir un monde dichotomique. Et il est établi ici.
I just wanted to add that there's also the psychology aspects in it, and especially when it describes its leg like stick-like legs, and its association actually, because they were playing like they were in Russia and they are in Australia, and some things about the trees, and actually there's the eucalyptus and all the paperbacks, which are really close to the Russian bird trees, which are really a little elongated and white, but also with patches of black. So it's association between what they were playing and what they see actually, and yeah, I just want to say that it's psychological action.
Yeah, definitely. I think, as we said before, there is that transfer of them being in their imaginary world and then trying to go back to reality and using categories from that. As you said, the stick, them perceiving him as a stick because he comes from the land, from the swamp, and basically trying to distinguish as well. This is a matter of getting out of the game, of children's representation. It's also a matter of perception. Quand le fait qu'il soit irréel, machin, qu'il ait l'air d'être des bouts de bois parce qu'il sort d'un endroit où il y en a, c'est aussi une représentation littéraire dans la perception. D'accord? So you can also look at it in that way. That works quite well. Any other thoughts on Jamie and how he's introduced? We've said lots of things. So. Nice. What about in the first point? We talked about the dichotomy of the settlement. I guess we spoke about childhood as a moment of innocence and the games. Did you find any other main themes that are established? I guess we mentioned language as well. I'm hugging my book. Are there any other main themes that you guys thought of in this?
The fear of the confrontation and the fear of the confrontation of Aboriginal people is really a thing that is present here. Like, we're being raided by blacks, there's so many false alarms that have come to this. They are kind of living in this spiritual fear of confrontation.
Definitely, and this anxiety is something that's developed throughout the novel. When Andy McKillop imagines the stone, he imagines it because there are all of these anxieties of you know, about the Aborigines and what they could do. You also have when Jemmy is attacked, this is a result of the village's anxiety, which results in actual violence. Okay, so the novel is very much a reflection on anxieties generated by that in-between figure. So that works quite well. Any other thoughts? What's the final image we get of Jemmy? This is an important bit. Where is he at the end of that?
He's standing on the fence.
Yeah, he's standing on the fence. This is a very important symbol. Okay, he's at that moment caught in between the two worlds. It's before he enters the settlement, and he's no longer part of that. He stands very much on the fence. And this is representative of his whole position, if you want, in the novel. Okay, it's a very symbolic moment. And I don't know if you remember, but right at the end of the novel, what Janet and Lachlan discuss is that moment of him on the fence. Okay, this moment when they come across the unknown and when they have him in between two worlds. And of course, the fence symbolizes that separation between the binary, the two opposite worlds. Okay, so it's an opposition between the savage, the civilized, nature, and human, if you want. And it's basically when he jumps off the fence that he's recognized as a human as well. Also, pretty much self and other. Sorry.
There's a reference to the blazing earth.
To what?
The blazing earth.
Yep.
As if he was stepping into a dangerous planet. Which was going.
Yeah, I think this is probably in reference to the heat in Australia. Like, where in Queensland in the summer it would get extremely hot. Like there is that contradiction that they're right in the middle of summer, possibly because it's extremely hot. And he says, well, I'm not sure if you've lived in really warm countries, but when it gets really hot, it's true you have trouble seeing through your eyes because of the light and the heat. And this is what they describe about Lachlan. Ironically, this is when he chooses to play pretend in the snow at the beginning. Okay, so you can see that there's also a whole range of cultural differences. One thing that is established here is the cultural difference between Lachlan and his cousins. And one thing that you all talked about a little bit is also the gender stereotypes that Lachlan has in mind what a man should do. And he's doing that, like he's going for it. He's not too sure about himself, but he's still trying to go for it, and he's trying to defend and take the gun and be there and hunt. Okay, so you've got all of these gender stereotypes that are also evoked in there, and that Lachlan tries to come to terms with in the whole novel. All right, so some of the things we haven't mentioned. Yes, you've got right at the beginning, the very first sentence tells you they saw something extraordinary. Okay, so right from the beginning, you're being told that Jemmy is out of the ordinary, that this moment is going to define the whole novel. Il y a quand même un choix qui est fait dans ce roman-là, qui est de commencer par, si vous voulez, l'action qui va changer l'histoire. D'accord ? On aurait pu avoir par exemple 4-5 chapitres qui nous expliquent la vie du settlement. Non, ici on va directement dans ce moment-là. Et ensuite, je ne sais pas si vous avez vu, mais les chapitres, en fait, on a le moment de Jemmy qui est sur the fence, et ensuite des fois on va vers l'avant, des fois on va vers l'arrière, on revient là, on revient là. En termes de narration, enfin de chronologie, ce roman il part dans tous les sens, d'accord ? Il va vraiment, bon, généralement c'est chronologique, mais en termes de perspective, on fait que revenir à des moments, etc. Donc il faut bien garder ça en tête. But basically you can see that there's a sense of suspense that is built. You're being told you're going to hear about something extraordinary, then you go back to the game, and then you have that extraordinary moment. Okay, so Jemmy is built up as being something, wow, if you will, that is going to happen. One thing we haven't talked about, I'm guessing you saw, is the problem with that sentence. Okay, of course what you would say is I'm a British subject, okay? And he's saying I'm a British object. So this is of course ironic in the sense that this is what Jemmy is. He is treated as an object by the children, in particular Lachlan, that sort of, you know, walks around him and, you know, takes a bit of responsibility and power from being associated with him. But of course, Jemmy is also an object of the British Empire in the sense that he was taken to Australia, he was left off the boat, he was just objectified and taken to places, not being treated as an individual. Okay, so this is an important bit to consider, and he is treated very much by the children, you know, not necessarily as an individual, but as an object, as a foil, or as someone that they can take along, etc. Okay, so you need to think about this aspect as well. What did we not mention? The other thing that is also quite present in this extract is the fact that there is a grotesque dimension to Jemmy. Okay, Jemmy is not really threatening. That is, he's not described as a monster, as truly threatening. What's threatening about him is the association that the kids generate, that it's an Aboriginal person, therefore there's a danger, but it's not him. He actually looks ridiculous. If you read it again, you'll see he's described as a bulga, as a water bird, as a thing, as a scarecrow. It's not exactly you're a crazy monster. Okay, so he is grotesque. And throughout the novel, there's something very ridiculous about Jemmy. He's very often grotesque. In fact, he's often oscillating between the grotesque and the sublime. Okay, there are things about him that are wonderful, and there are things about him that are just plain ridiculous. Okay, so you can see that this is already set up at the beginning, that this character is actually a little bit grotesque. And again, I think this was mentioned by Cédric, but do consider that this is something told through the eyes of the children. Okay, at some point, on va pas aller dans le détail, mais vous avez plein de moments où on passe en discours indirect libre, d'accord, notamment quand vous avez, je vais y arriver, quand vous avez le moment où il joue, d'accord, ici vous êtes projeté en fait dans ce que pense Lachlan, ensuite vous en ressortez, vous y retournez, etc. Mais on est vraiment dans l'état d'esprit des enfants, c'est-à-dire qu'on n'a pas un point de vue qui est extérieur, on a vraiment la scène vue du point de vue des enfants, avec le fait qu'ils imaginent que c'est une partie du marécage, et puis que c'est un oiseau, etc. D'accord? Donc il y a un choix aussi ici de montrer ça à travers leur vision pour vraiment vous amener à l'interpréter de cette manière-là. Ça va? Eh ben, je pense qu'on va s'arrêter là, sinon ça ne marchera pas. Je vous donne juste vos devoirs pour la semaine prochaine. Juste une chose, c'est vraiment important que vous lisiez les romans. D'accord, je vois bien qu'il y a plein de gens qui n'ont pas lu, mais le travail qu'on vous demande en littérature, c'est de réfléchir à un roman. Si vous n'avez pas lu le roman, vous méritez moins 10, d'accord? Vous ne pouvez pas mériter même un 0, vu que vous n'avez même pas lu le truc que vous êtes censé analyser. Donc pensez-y bien, à partir de la semaine prochaine, on passe à réfléchir à de la dissertation. Vous allez fondamentalement vous ennuyer en cours. Pour la semaine prochaine, je vous demande de lire un article de Peter Otto sur Remembering Babylon. Je sais plus, je crois que c'est Forgetting Colonialism qui s'appelle, et de noter les arguments principaux, les arguments qui vous semblent utiles pour analyser le roman. Ok? See you next week.